Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it is my pleasure to rise and speak to this motion. And just to remind all the members here today what this motion is all about, it's incentivizing a lower carbon footprint in Prince Edward Island. And as Mr. Speaker well aware, we asked a lot of questions about the reducing carbon emissions and the carbon pricing strategy and related information to that during question period. And this is a motion that we brought to the floor a while back that addresses just these sorts of things. And I guess, Mr. Speaker, the root of the motion is that in order to reduce our carbon footprint, we have to give people incentive to do it. Right now, there are a group of people that have realized, if we keep emitting greenhouse gases at the current rate we're doing it, we're going to destroy our world. But unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, the vast majority of the population is not taking action without incentives. And that's what this is all about. And I think, Mr. Speaker, that's what this government is missing right now in their approach, Mr. Speaker. They keep talking about strategies and taxes and what they're going to do in the future. But what we need right now are incentives, Mr. Speaker, to help people lower their carbon footprint immediately. Now, Mr. Speaker, one of the reasons behind this is PEI really, its contribution to greenhouse gases is quite small compared to the other provinces. One reason, of course, is because we have a small population. But another reason is we really don't have a big heavy industrial sector, Mr. Speaker, which traditionally uses the vast majority of fossil fuels in power. And another thing, Mr. Speaker, is we have tremendous penetration of wind turbines in this province that, on average, provide 29 to 30% of our energy needs and can provide over 90% of the island's energy needs when the wind is blowing, Mr. Speaker. So Prince Edward Islanders, from a whole island perspective, already have a lower carbon footprint per capita than the vast majority of provinces in Canada. And the number that I had used today in question period, Mr. Speaker, was about half of what would be expected given the size of our population compared to the rest of Canada. So what we're saying in this motion, Mr. Speaker, is we've made strides. We've taken steps to lower our carbon footprint on a broad scale as an island as a whole through initiatives, Mr. Speaker, of government and good decisions made by past governments on how to generate our energy. We're not sure, Mr. Speaker, that a carbon tax is the right way to use a stick to get islanders to change their ways of generating carbon emissions and to lower their carbon footprint, Mr. Speaker, without offering incentives first and allowing islanders the chance to use those incentives before the stick is taken to them, Mr. Speaker. We would like to see the carrot offered. Mr. Speaker, this government had an incentive, it was a tax credit for hybrid cars, Mr. Speaker, that was removed in 2013. And that actually de-incentivized the purchase of hybrid vehicles. Now, Mr. Speaker, I myself own a hybrid vehicle, and I found that just doing the financial calculation on the amount of gas I would save was enough for me to justify the purchase of that vehicle. So one of the incentives that would cost very little money, and I've mentioned this before, Mr. Speaker, is very simply putting calculators online on the great new government website, gets that good calculator up there so islanders can plug in the price of a vehicle and the mileage, and they can see, bang, this is going to save me money. It may, in the long term, it may look like it does cost more up front, Mr. Speaker, but in the long run, this is the right thing to do for my wallet, Mr. Speaker. And on top of it all, it lowers my carbon footprint, and it allows me to help this island and reduce global warming. And that's very important, Mr. Speaker, and that's a very low-cost way. And these are the sort of things we need to do as soon as possible. It should have been done yesterday. This is a suggestion I made at least 6 months ago, Mr. Speaker, and we haven't seen much movement on this. And so that's what I'd emphasize this government. We got to get these incentives in place right away. And Mr. Speaker, transportation, it's no mistake that I talk about transportation first, because transportation is responsible, Mr. Speaker, for over 70% of the carbon emissions on PEI, and it's really the area we need to target first. So we would like to see incentives to assist islanders in reducing their carbon footprint, especially for transportation, but also for heat, because they are the largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions in this province. Another suggestion, Mr. Speaker, that I brought up at the climate strategy consultations, and it's one that was brought to me by another islander, is the idea, and we talked about it during capital budgets, Mr. Speaker, just recently, is the idea that we could use our school transportation, Mr. Speaker, as public transportation as well. And unfortunately, the Minister of Finance really did not understand the concept when he brought back the information during our debate on capital budgets. He thought we were trying to say, take the public transit and use it for school buses. No, we're really saying, let's marry the two together. Let's take our school buses, which go across the vast majority of the island, and have a huge fleet. Mr. Speaker, I believe we were well over 300 school buses when you count the spares in there. And marry the two together, and then you'll have a fleet of buses that cover the island that can be used for both public transit and school transportation. Now, there were some concerns there, Mr. Speaker, that children up to the age they are in grade 4, around 10 years old, maybe shouldn't ride the bus with adults, Mr. Speaker, and that would be one of the challenges to iron out. But right now, Mr. Speaker, we have school buses that are used twice a day. They're used for one set of routes in the morning, and then they sit idle for a large period of the day, and then they're used again in the early evening, and then they sit idle. Mr. Speaker, if we could take those buses and make sure they were the right type of buses that you could use for public transit as well, you could have buses that were active right from 5 in the morning right till midnight, Mr. Speaker, and it would actually be at a much lower cost than trying to provide a separate public transit system, which it seems that government is always considering. So that's one idea of what can be done in terms of incentives, Mr. Speaker, to help reduce our carbon footprint, help people drive less, and stop burning fossil fuels. Now, Mr. Speaker, another thing I wanted to talk about is the fact that right now, when we're looking at the incentives to reduce carbon emissions, if islanders, Mr. Speaker, locally produce energy, power, for example through solar panels or through wind energy, and therefore lower the amount of electricity we have to import from off-island, for example, Mr. Speaker, from New Brunswick Power, we don't get credit for the lowering of carbon emissions that produces. We're the ones who are locally producing the green, clean energy, but it's New Brunswick that gets to claim the carbon emissions. We don't get credit for reducing our electricity and producing our electricity locally. And that's something as well that would be a huge incentive, Mr. Speaker, because it would lower the amount we would have to raise in a carbon tax, because we would get credit for all of the carbon emission reduction that we would be doing, Mr. Speaker. And so that's something I'd really like this Minister of Community Lands and Environment and this government to look at very closely, negotiate with the other provinces and the federal government to make sure that we get credit for all of the carbon emission reduction that we're going to get, because that will lower the amount of tax that we have to indeed charge, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, one thing you might be thinking, Mr. Speaker, and some other members and people listening today, might be thinking, it's great. The official opposition is saying through this motion, you need to incentivize a lower carbon footprint. Well, where are you going to get the money, Mr. Speaker? Well, Mr. Speaker, we've already heard that this government is thinking about putting in a new tax. They want to put the HST on home heating fuel. That's one place they could get the money without having to introduce a new tax, Mr. Speaker. Also, Mr. Speaker, when they brought in the HST, $25 million, Mr. Speaker, of surplus HST that they didn't need to bring in, they did not make it revenue neutral. Really, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to finding the money to incentivize a lower carbon footprint, it's all about priorities, Mr. Speaker. And I know the Minister of Transportation, Infrastructure and Energy will agree with me when I say that instead of spending $35 million of provincial taxpayer dollars to build a new bypass to Cornwall and put more cars on the road, Mr. Speaker, and burn more fossil fuels, we could have used at least a portion of that money, Mr. Speaker, to incentivize the purchase of hybrid vehicles and electric vehicles, Mr. Speaker, so we would burn less fossil fuels and, in fact, cause less people to be driving cars all the way around, less maintenance costs on our roads. It all adds up. And so it's a matter of spending priorities, Mr. Speaker. That's what it really is all about. So, Mr. Speaker, really, again, just to remind members what this motion is all about, the last clause is, therefore, be it further resolved that government defer the imposition of a carbon tax until potential incentives could be introduced and their effectiveness measured and evaluated. And this is extremely important, Mr. Speaker. This is something we do very poorly here on PEI in our government, in this government, is we don't measure and evaluate the results of incentives and programs we put in place. I mean, when we do, Mr. Speaker, the tendency is to try and skew the results in a way that perhaps misrepresents the statistics. I mean, Mr. Speaker, we just heard about the PISA test results, and now we're finding that there's a whole section of students, poor performing students, that didn't even write the test, Mr. Speaker. That's an example. So it's extremely important that when we incentivize a lower carbon footprint, we have the proper metrics in place to measure the results. And I believe the acronym we're looking for here is SMART, Mr. Speaker. They have to be specific and measurable metrics that we can really rely on in the future to make sure we know if the incentives are working. And I think they will, Mr. Speaker. So with that, I do urge all members to really carefully go through and read the motion again. It's been a while since it's been on the floor. Make sure you read this motion. Make sure you understand it, because I think if you do and you think it through, you'll realize that this is really the first step we should take before introducing a carbon tax. And I think, Mr. Speaker, looking around this room today, that we're going to have the vast majority of members in this House vote in favour of this motion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, honourable member.